Hi, everybody. Thanks for clicking on the link and watching this video of the Planning Curious Museum Person blog. This is my very first interview with a gentleman named Wendell T. Joseph, um, and who is a planner. We met through a series of almost happenstance, which seems to be this classic way of planners and museum people meeting. Um, and Wendell has been kind enough to actually sit on a conference session panel for the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums, using up some political capital at a brand new job, which I really appreciate. And he has generously agreed to be my first interview. When I spoke with some museum folks, they were like, interview some planners. So here we are. So Wendell, if you could talk a little bit just about your background, like what brought you to planning and then the different jobs within planning you've had, because I think that is really helpful to see that there's a lot of different ways that it happens.
Yeah, great question. And, first and foremost, thanks for the invitation. It's always great to connect with you and talk about planning and museum stuff and everything in between. In terms of how I got into planning, I actually, and this is not terribly uncommon for planners, but I first started in architecture. That's what I went to school for originally. And it was through that program, through my course of study there, that I started to be exposed to different ways of thinking about the built environment. At that time, nobody would, no, I don't remember anybody really saying urban planning, but there were courses that I took that, were less focused on specific buildings and building typologies, and it was more about urbanism, generally speaking, right? And, kind of like, how the composition of streets of building of facades of neighborhoods, and not just that, but how that changes and shifts over time based on a variety of factors. um, and that really caught my interest, and I think it that interest was solidified during the study abroad summer, the summer study abroad summer, yeah, where which was a requirement of our program, where you go overseas and spend 5 weeks, a week in different cities, and just again learning about different ways of that different ways that urban environments come together. And that was like, the aha moment for me. Again, at the time, I still didn't know that urban planning was a thing. I knew urban design was a thing, but not urban planning per se. And so the that seed was planted, and I finished my architecture program, got my master's, and I knew that I would eventually make the switch into what would eventually be urban planning. But I figured, I'll go out, I'll work a little bit in an architect's office or whatever. When I'm ready, I'll go back to school and do this thing. And of course, that didn't exactly go as planned, because I graduated with my master's in 2011, which is mid-recession, and nobody's really hiring entry-level architects. So 2 years later, I'm back in school, doing my urban planning degree. And I've been in the profession ever since I graduated in 2015 now. So yeah, that's how I got into it. And yeah, over the course of my career, again, I've met a lot of planners who come from an architecture background. Some have actually worked as an architect and made the switch. Some, have done dual degrees in architecture and urban planning. Um, and yeah, so I think a very a common thing. And in my experience, again, it's the reasons have been fairly similar, where it's like you can work on a building or you can work on like a lot. I think the perspective and the scope and scale of planning, I think, is what attracts, um, some of us converts into the space.
Cool,
Oh
because
yeah, and then yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
go
I'm sorry.
ahead. No, go,
No,
go, go.
no, I remember there was a second part to the question in terms of planning jobs that I had done, but I can kind of get to that. I think you had some want to say follow up.
Yeah, I had just the one that I hear from planners, and maybe it's just because of the people I've met, that there are a number of people who went in it more from the community organizing end of things. Um, so
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting.
that's the other, I think, big thing. And that is something for me, it doesn't seem to be, I don't remember it being communicated to me in that particular way, but I think it's one of those things that you kind of like start to just uncover as you get deeper and deeper into the work. I think there are definitely a lot of people who come into planning because of the passion for the interest in and the kind of desire to work with and for communities to kind of make those places better. And I feel like that ties a lot to personal experiences.
Mhm,
Uh, in the sense of, when I remember growing up, my neighborhood was X, Y, and Z, and I remember yada yada yada. So it's like sometimes it goes even back to like childhood experiences and
mhm,
what folks remember about, or different aspects of their growing up in their particular neighborhood, and then making the connection years later. It's like, oh, so urban planning is how you can do da 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 da. Well, now I want to be urban planning because I remember what that was like. I don't want that for somebody else, and so on and so forth. Another one, I find that a lot of there are a good amount of teachers and social workers who are also very interested in planning.
interesting.
Um, and so I think they're coming at it from the other side, where because as a teacher and a planner, I'm sorry, as a teacher or social worker, you're very much focused on the more social, kind of like the effects that planning has on people, on families, right? The relationship between spatial design and social inequities is inextricably linked, right? Where kind of like one impacts the other, right? And then obviously, why shouldn't it, right? Because we know that the history of community development in this country is steeped in systemic racism, right? And so where things are and where there aren't, how you get to a place or don't or can't, and all these other things are, very much tied to, the otherness that this country is basically built on. And so when you're a teacher, you're faced with that every single day when your kids come in and, some of them either, don't have food to eat or don't, have a place to go afterwards or as a social worker, so it's like, they teachers and social workers can like see this on a you know, they're on the front lines of it, but in a very different way. And then once they start to make that connection to, space and the built environment, it starts to kind of like reinforce what they've witnessed and experienced in their professional capacities for a long time. So that's another interesting connection there. But
What
yeah, all
I,
that to say, yeah,
yeah, well,
it's yeah,
yeah, one thing I'm noticing is that in every single one of those cases, the through line is I was working at the effects at a small, or I was working at a small scale. I was working on a particular building. I was working on my particular neighborhood's particular issue. I was working with this certain set of kids and recognizing that you needed to go up to a higher scale
yeah,
to look at those systemic things. So that's
yeah.
really interesting. Cool.
It is. It is. And again, it's one of those things where more often than not, people don't necessarily know that urban planning is a thing that exists, right? So as like an actual like, oh, there are people who actually like do this. Um, um, and it's not to say that they obviously people do this, but they don't always necessarily know like the name. Like, you might, obviously
Right.
your elected officials and politicians all kind of have something to do with it, right? But in terms of like actual like professional technical staff who like do this on a day-to-day basis, that's not always a known thing, or at least if it is, not what it's called. Um, and so it's like once that connection is made, then it's like okay. Um, so whenever people ask me what I do, and I say, hey, I'm an urban planner, I almost always follow up with, okay, have you heard of this before? Do you know what that is? And I think
And what's
these
the
days
answer?
I feel like early on it was always like a no, not really, or they'll like take a guess. But I feel like it's becoming more, think of a common thing where people like, okay, yeah, I kind of like know what that is.
I think people sort of know what it is. I don't think they recognize how it touches everything
Yeah, yeah,
and how the past designs created what we have today very deliberately.
for
And
sure,
so, yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
cool. Well, that was a lovely diversion. Not at all what I was expecting to go on, and it's Fabulous. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, so given that urban planning does touch a lot of things, there's also a lot of different ways in which one can be an urban planner, different levels of organization. So, and your history kind of captures a few of those. So if you could talk about those different things, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, sure. So I feel like there are at least five like big buckets of where you can practice planning. So obviously the first one is public sector, right? So, working for government. So it could be local government, it could be state, it could be regional governments, which can be like a quasi thing. And so as a, from a public sector side of things, the work looks a little bit different. And they're all obviously there are similarities, but there are some clear differences because of just the spaces that you work in and some of the constraints that they have or opportunities or all that kind of stuff. So public sector is one way to one space where you can work in planning. Um, and so in public sector, these are folks who are, very much like on the ground, day-to-day type stuff. They're, working in their particular communities or cities, and so they have like, or at least should have like that really deep local knowledge of who the major players are, what the issues are, what needs to be addressed and when and how and so on and so forth. Um, Private sector, typically you're working as a consultant. And so in that work, you'll respond to different RFPs or requests for proposals that folks will put out a lot of times in the public sector, but also in different sectors as well, to do different kinds of projects and different kinds of work. And again, there are some opportunities that come in with that. Obviously, as a consultant, you have a little bit more, you may have a little bit more leeway in the how creative you can be, how far you can push your client to consider different things, to do different things, and so on and so forth. And so you provide that technical capacity and expertise to your clients to be able to address a wide range of planning problems. So that's the second one. The third one, it would be, I think, institutional. And so broadly that looks like, campus planning. So, working for different universities who do their own planning for stuff that's, for their property, for their campuses and whatnot. And that's really interesting work because it's like it could look like a combination of public and private work where it's the university, so they have they can just do effectively not like whatever they want, but there's a lot more kind of like control and hopefully appetite to do different things that you may not be able to do outside of that space. So that's like institutional planning or institutional sector. And then in a nonprofit, that a lot of times looks like working at hyper local levels. So it can be for CDCs, for example, and that can be really challenging, but also really really rewarding work. Because again, it's hyper focused at a
By
in a
CDC, you mean Community
community.
Development Corporation, not
Correct.
Centers for Disease Control, or a
Yes.
CNC router.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you flagging that
No,
because yeah, I don't
everybody
want to
has
just
their
throw,
lingo.
yeah, I don't want to just throw acronyms at people like, what does that mean?
We
Yeah,
have that.
so
We have all of that too.
yeah, so community development corporations, and those, range in size and scale, but again, those tend to be very, very focused on a particular neighborhood, a particular geography, and that's an opportunity to dive even deeper in the work than you would at the local government level. Um, and I think for as far as a nonprofit, you can also loop in business improvement districts in that as well. And that again is also really interesting work in that the focus is also hyper local because you're talking about a geographic area that's been designated as part of a business improvement district. And a lot of that work tends to, skew more towards like, economic development type stuff, placemaking and activation strategies, and mobility, open space, so on and so forth. And then like I think the last one would be, which is still kind of like in the nonprofit world, but it's more research focused. So working for think tanks or policy centers that do some deep research and provide reports and white papers and all that kind of stuff that can help really the other sectors and how they navigate their work. And so, Smart Growth America is an example of one. They're based in DC. They do a lot of, research and around a range of I think a lot transportation is one of the main ones. I think there may be some other areas as well. Um, so yeah, so those are the five. So public sector, private sector, institutional, nonprofit, and then research. So it's a
Cool.
really, really broad range
It is.
of
And then
people.
there's also, in terms of thinking about this from the museum side, um, I worked with an urban planning professor, so he was training planners. So that's
Right.
another sector where it's just literally and his research was on community engagement. So in terms of museums, museums love to do research partnerships, partly because it's a good way to get money to do projects that are interesting, and you build in your subject matter experts.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing I thought about, which what came up as a question, and because you worked for the city, you can explain that there are, I'm going to say, professional planners who work as government employees who do the day to day. There are often also, and I don't know how often, a planning board of some, so basically a legislative branch. Are they usually appointed? It sounds like it's all over the map depending on size of
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. So that's yeah, and I think that's a good way to just start is that it's gonna look a different from one town or city to the next.
Mhm.
Um, it's not exactly a legislative board,
Right.
because they're not creating um, legislation um, to
And
regulate
what
planning
are
or
they?
anything like that.
Regulatory board, basically?
Regulatory would be, I think, a little bit more
Okay.
appropriate. And so, what the planning board typically does is that they'll review different proposals
Mhm.
for development projects. And those can range from small to large and everything in between. And again, a lot of this is going to, my answer is going to be based on like my understanding and experience from working in the city of Cambridge, which is unique in a lot of different ways. Um, but the planning board there would just basically review special permit applications. And so in the code, the zoning code or the code of ordinances, I'm forgetting the actual name now. There are certain stipulations for development proposals that are subject to that would be subject to special permit. And once they are subject to special permit, the planning board has to review it. The planning board reviews it. They'll, make a recommendation on it or a ruling, or rather, and then kind of like that's part of the development process. You have to appear before the planning board. And so that's kind of like the role that a board typically plays. Is to look at these special cases of an actual like thing that somebody's planning to do, considering the pros and cons. Well, what does the zoning code say you can or can't do? Where can you bend those rules or make some exceptions, provide some variances? Is how to what degree does this proposal that we're looking at adhere to different design standards? Is it in keeping with a neighborhood's aesthetic and all that kind of stuff? So there are kind of different criteria that they'll examine, look from one proposal to the next. But that's kind of like where they kind of like fit in. So it's like looking at different work that interpret zoning language in different ways based on X, and then they'll provide a ruling or a recommendation or decision on that. So yeah, so whereas the planning staff are like day-to-day planning work in a municipality, planning board is looking at specific proposals to do development projects in that particular area or neighborhood. Sometimes
And,
those positions are paid, sometimes
oh,
they're
okay.
not. They're
Yeah.
volunteer. So again,
Volunteer.
that one is going to be based on obviously a city's resources and that kind of stuff, as to whether they can actually pay their planning board members or whether it's really just a volunteer thing. Sometimes they're appointed, sometimes you apply for the position. I think in some cases they may even be elected. Um, but again, it depends on the um what the language in the city's code of ordinances says for the planning board. So that I will say that there is
Okay,
a piece of legislation that should say, here's what the planning board is, here's what they do,
right.
duties and responsibilities. Here are the terms. Here's who can be part of it, so on and so forth. So more often than not, there's some piece of paper that basically says like, here's what this body of individuals do.
Cool. So now I get to rewrite, get to correct myself on something. Having
Right.
written pieces that haven't launched yet, it's really nice to talk to people, and I'm like, oh, I can fix it before you put it out there. So one of the things I did a literature review for a museum in a southern state where sea level rise is the big deal, and was reviewing county level plans. And one of the plans talked very specifically how code, so zoning, building code, all of those sort of regulatory nitty gritty, um, were out of step with the plan because they got promulgated a while back, and they literally said
Yeah.
something like, the way our code is, it is rewarding exactly the wrong behaviors and the wrong outcomes. So, and I imagine that always lags. So when codes are being updated, who's doing that? And you're going to say it depends in which community. So it's not necessarily the zoning board that is promulgating regs. That's going back to staff.
Well, so when it comes to updating zoning language, a zoning board is absolutely part of the process. And
Okay.
so I think there's a distinction. I think this is a good point to make a distinction between a planning board and a
Planning
zoning
board and
board.
a zoning board,
Yeah,
right?
and
And a
and
and
that
a building agency, right? Because building code is yet another agency, right?
right, because that
Usually.
would be more like inspectional services and yada
Hmm.
yada yada. So yeah, they're
Yeah.
and I'll say that zoning board, the acronym changes again from one time. That I've seen ZBA, right, Zoning Board of Appeals. I've seen BZA, Board of Zoning Appeals. Same thing. And so their job is basically anything zoning related. So if you're talking about changing zoning language, which I will say does not happen that often, or at least not as often as it should, because it is a long process, because it's not just planning staff that's involved. You're talking about obviously the zoning board folks, the law department is going to get involved. Um, Planning board will probably maybe weigh in a little bit. You may want to consult with different city departments and different individuals to try to like make sure that you're not putting something on paper that actually makes either isn't consistent with practice or makes their lives more difficult or other kind of stuff. So changing zoning language is actually a very it can be a very arduous and complicated process because of what the implications are. For better for worse, the zoning is basically a sacred text of how stuff gets done in cities, and so it's not something that just changes. And once those changes are made, obviously you're talking about uh, impacts that its impact will last for quite some time. And to your point, I mean, I remember years ago there have been a couple of articles that I remember there was one article I read, and it was specifically about New York City, and another one came out similarly, which was about Somerville, and basically the essence of those articles were the same, where it's s- like an overwhelming majority of the buildings that currently exist in those cities just are not compliant with zoning code. Um, you know what I mean? And again, it just speaks to just a certain era where things were just like built, and how, today the way we understand things, it's like it just wouldn't like basically those buildings could not be built today. Is what the point of that article was. I have to track those down and send it to you. But yeah, so zoning is another thing altogether, and a very very important uh, document. So yeah, but they don't just change.
They don't. Yeah, and I mean, and I think this is for museum listeners. This is why and I'll do a blog post about this if I haven't already by the time this is posted. There's a place called the Wild Center up in the Adirondacks, and they they found that a lot of people post Hurricane Irene wiped out the area, a lot of lost bridges, shut down downtowns and stuff. And so people were interested in building usually their second homes with super green sustainability in mind. And the local builders didn't know the materials, didn't know the equipment, didn't want to stand behind something they didn't even know how to install or use, didn't know how to comply with laws. And so this museum, in addition to doing a ton of other climate work, holds an every other year expo for local trades. And they bring in the manufacturers and the code so that people can feel comfortable, because if they walk in and do a project, they want to know that what they're using, they can stand behind.
Right.
And so that's what I think is really cool for museums, is finding ways to help people understand not just these big issues, but also like this nitty gritty policy stuff, like allowing accessory dwelling units or granny flats, those extra units in single family homes to increase housing, allowing for mixed use development. There's a lot of this stuff that's, when it's said out loud, sounds like gobbledygook and boring, and I don't want to have to go to that meeting, but it's really important to
Yeah.
making what is planned actually happen on the ground.
Yeah.
So I think there's an opportunity for museums to really, first of all, they have to go figure out what their local structure is, because you've just pointed out how wildly different it is. And here in New England, it's very different from California. I mean, we don't have counties around here, really. In California, there are people who live in just a county and not a town.
Right.
So it's really, really different. And forget people in other countries where it's also very different. So I think the first thing is figuring out what's going on in your community, but then understanding all the pieces to make this stuff happen. And those are all opportunities for public engagement and education. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
cool.
Yeah.
Um, so this is great. Well, I love that we're not going to get through half of our questions. I love it. I love it. Um, can you talk about, so you're now working for a transportation planning independent consulting company.
Correct.
So transportation planning is a whole other huge piece, especially around climate and
Right.
former destruction of cities and the amount of money going into infrastructure planning.
Right.
Um, so this is really a moment, I think, in this country. I've talked to somebody who works for a transit agency, and he really said, like, this is our next great highway moment, except not doing the destruction that we did in the highway. So I'd love to hear about your
Right.
work at,
Yeah.
at Tool.
Yeah, I'll preface that by saying, I mean, earlier I talked about just, 5 different sectors or spaces where you can engage in planning. Um, but, in terms of like the actual work that you do, that also varies and can be quite broad. So there are folks who specialize in housing, so they're housing planners. Folks specialize in economic development or small businesses. There are some people who are transportation planners, but even then, you can within transportation, like you can be a bike ped planner, right? So doing active transportation, you can do transit. Um, once upon a time, there are people who focused on like highways and stuff like that. Obviously, we that's that's a its own can of worms. That could be a whole different podcast. Um, you can focus on the climate, right? So a climate planner, looking at climate change and climate mitigation. People do parks and open spaces and all that kind of stuff. So it's like you can slice planning in so many different ways within the different sectors that I talked about. So I just kind of like wanted to add that in there as well. Not everybody does everything. Um, so that being said, right now I'm at Tool Design Group. We're a full service transportation planning and engineering firm. Headquarters are in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm in the Boston office, and we basically work on virtually any or everything transportation related. So, obviously, so the firm started off as active transportation planners, the bike ped planners. In fact, when Tool started, we were the only ones doing bike ped planning in America. So I think in a lot of ways, kind of like started this movement of active transportation planning that you see in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
Um,
So just to highlight, active transportation means walking, biking. I'm assuming it also includes mobility devices, anything that's
Yes.
more,
Yeah, mobility system device. Basically, any kind of
anything that,
mobility or mode of transportation or travel that isn't automobile dependent.
or, oh, that, but, or public transit, like bus or train
Well, it could, yeah, because I mean that would be transit, but in
transit.
the
Yeah.
world of active transportation, I think it's more so trying to look at non-vehicular transportation.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
and
And
so yeah,
those are so,
active transportation would definitely be focused on some of the more people
yep.
like where you're kind of powering your own movement.
Yeah.
Um, but
And the,
sometimes transit might find its way in there in some form or fashion.
yeah, I mean, and what I think for people who haven't lived where they were dependent on public transit, that active transportation, if that's not safe, accessible, easy, then you can't get to the, like, you have to get to the train or the subway
Yeah.
safely. Yeah, right.
Also,
And home
yeah, but also comfortably. That's the other thing that's
comfortably,
important.
100%.
Yeah, that's the other thing that's
Yeah,
important to point out. Like safely is yes, absolutely. That's like the bare minimum.
right.
Comfortably is also pretty important because that's what encourages more people to then engage in and transportation than not. And so there's this really cool graphic that we'll use in our reports that show how, for example, let's say somebody's riding a bike. There are people ride. There's different levels of comfort that riders will have. And so the comfort piece is pretty important because, hardcore, bikers may just, they'll bike anywhere and they'll be fine. But that's not necessarily going to be everybody. And so level of comfort is a very, very important thing that we do in our work, are looking at active transportation planning and building out active transportation infrastructure and networks is the level
Mhm.
of comfort that a road will have. And there are different factors that obviously come into that, the number of lanes, what's the posted speed limit, so on and so forth. So being
Yeah.
able to create um, the network in a way that makes it comfortable is another big piece.
That's a really good point. I had to read Walkable Cities book
Okay.
to figure out, and then I had to get an e-bike because I was in upper management and I live in a city that's all hills. So I
Hmm.
had to get an e-bike
Yep,
and a
yep,
helmet
yep.
I thought was cute.
Of course, yeah. You got to look
and
cute on your
figured
bike. Yeah.
and figured out using a walkability book how to read the streets to figure out a route that I could get from home to work, not a sweaty mess and not terrified. And yeah, and it was interesting because going home in the dark, I had reflective gear. But I got catcalled at an age when I
Ah.
shouldn't have gotten catcalled. And suddenly it was like, oh,
Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah,
I mean, that's a really important point, and it hadn't connected in my brain. So
yeah.
very
And
cool.
first of all, congratulations, you're a transportation planner. But I think you raise a really, really great point that I think can should not be understated is that how we perceive space, it varies from one person individual to the next, right? So, as
Absolutely.
somebody who, maybe identifies as woman or as a woman, your experience is going to be very different than somebody who is a male or is or identifies as a man. So again, like even
Yeah.
when I say stuff like when we say stuff like safety and comfort,
Hmm.
that's in some ways it can be objective, in a lot of ways it can also be subjective,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's
Right.
where engagement is really, really important to catch the blind spots, right?
Yeah.
And again, so in our work that we do, we'll say, trying to encourage, safe and accessible and comfortable transportation for all users of all ages and abilities. Ability is another thing altogether. You know what I mean? And so there's so many different, it's not a pure science where it's like if we do X then Y. It's as much a qualitative as it is a quantitative endeavor. And so that's why I like to think of planning as both an art and a science. Because yes, we have our data, you can measure things, you can observe things, you can report back, but there's an art to it as well. And I think
Hmm.
it's very, very important to find a balance between the two, or when where there needs to be an imbalance in order to
Mm.
achieve a desired
Correct the,
end
yeah.
result. Bingo.
correct the past. So to me, part of that art, which the museum people would argue is also science, is that community engagement, that real listening to, because you, as you point out, you can't look and know what the issues are without, talking to people. So I'd love to hear if you had a magic wand, because you are one of the many people who say community engagement is the first thing cut. It's under resourced. I hear it over and over again. I have not found a study to back it up. It just seems to be common knowledge among every planner, planning consultant. It's like the first thing that's cut. Um, so if there were the time and space and all the other resources, what would good community engagement look like for any of these projects?
Yeah. So I'm of the mind that, and this is something that I kind of identified a long time ago. I think the problem with engagement, from my experience, my understanding, what I've observed, is that engagement with communities invariably happens when there's an actual project or process going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say there's 10 different processes or projects going on in your community. You're basically looking at 10 different engagement processes with for those particular plans, which is mind-boggling because it's not a great use of resources, what little there are. Meeting fatigue is the word that term that people are using more and more these days. And it cuts both ways. I mean, in as much as people, the community is going to get tired of having to go out to yet another community meeting for yet another project. On the city and consultant side of things, now it's like, okay, another public meeting that I have to go out in the evening. And for consultants, it's like another, and again, you're billing all your time to a project, so it's not a terribly efficient use of resources. What my thing would be is rather than having 10 different engagement processes for 10 different projects, flip it on its head, where maybe the project is community engagement, where you're putting your time and your resources and your, human power to creating uh, 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 the infrastructure and capacity mechanisms for continuous dialogue with communities that can then inform whatever project and process are going on. And so, as projects come and go, you can kind of like tap into that stream of conversation, of dialogue, what I mean, and basically be able to take what it is that you need from that can then inform, what you're doing, kind of like keep feeding back into that continuous stream, as opposed to what we have right now, where engagement starts and stops because the project is done, and then picks back up for the next thing and then stops. Like just be in dialogue with communities all the time, and as projects come and go, they tap into that stream. You see what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? I think
Yeah.
it's a lot more efficient. It cuts back, if not eliminates, meeting fatigue because you're not bringing people out, And the thing is that, and the thing that happens with that is when you have 10 different stuff for 10 different things, you'll have conflict. There have been so many times, I came across this a lot when I was working for the city of Cambridge, where people are upset that there are two different meetings going on at the same time. They want to be part of both, but they can't possibly be in two places at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And then
You know
they
what I
feel
mean?
like they've been deliberately cut out of something.
Right,
Somebody's
right,
trying to pull something fast on
exactly.
them.
And so it doesn't do us any favors when people
Mm-hmm.
already have a mistrust or skepticism of government and how things get done and how decisions are made. And when you have, two meetings going on at the same time, it's like, and it's not saying that it's intentional, right? But it's like because each, I mean, there's only so many days in the week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, I think so. If you were to flip uh, the paradigm on its head and just say the project is community engagement, the project is community dialogue, and from there we can inform whatever specific things are going to be happening across the community. You're talking about a completely different way of engaging in planning, but also in communities as part of that work. So that's what I would do. I just
That's
flip it upside down.
that's cool because I've spent some time on NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Anyway, NOAA's sort of community resiliency thing, and part of their theory of change is very much that planning, climate planning, resilience planning, and climate education have to go hand in hand. That the people most impacted by various climate changes are the most um, likely to A, identify what the issues are, and B, recognize what are feasible solutions and that they need to be part of that. So I think climate crisis, for all it's just sort of pushing it. It's like there is no other choice but to be putting that hand in hand. I noticed APA has something like a citizen planning academy or something like that. So there's like a public planning, but I mean, in some ways, what you're talking about is basically if you have ongoing community engagement, you're sort of basically empowering the trusted community messengers, right? And this is all about trusted messengers
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
and
I
trusted listeners.
yeah. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that model that I just outlined, I think it does something else, is that it makes it so that so the okay, let me back up. So like the the very early stages of the planning profession were not without was it was problematic. It was highly problematic.
It was
Because
colonialism.
basically, yeah, yeah,
100%. It was
you know,
colonialism.
settler colonialism,
100%.
made manifest. But it was the thing is like it was turn of like the I'd say the turn of the 20th century, since we're now in the 21st, right? Was where you really saw planning really become institutionalized. This is around like the industrial age, and how
Hmm.
cities are booming and all that kind of stuff, and the perceived social problems, there's blight and tenements and all that kind of stuff, and so planning kind of like as a formal practice emerged as a scientific and autocratic response to what were perceived to be social ills.
Scientific.
Right.
Put some quotes around scientific.
Right. So it was
Up
a
there with
very
eugenics.
so it's like a very like top-down, heavy-handed, approach to community development and addressing different concerns and all that kind of stuff. This is like the era that Robert Moses kind of like comes out of,
Robert
that
Moses.
the power broker, right? And that
Yeah,
whole, and then like the ultimate heavyweight fight right between Robert Moses and Janet Jacobs. But so I say all that to say is that that's kind of like where planning as a formal profession, that's where it comes from, right?
right,
It's essentially the power of the state to impose its will on space and people.
right,
And over time, I mean, obviously the profession has changed a little bit to where, okay, yeah, we got to bring communities into it, da 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 da, this, that, and the other. But it still doesn't necessarily challenge that paradigm of planners being the kind of like the technical experts that are then saying, here's what you need and here's what and how it needs to be done.
hmm,
And so a lot of folks, more recently, you'll see a lot of talk more about community-led, community-driven planning, where it starts to challenge basically the power dynamic that exists in planning, where it's not just people, the city or consultants or whomever saying, these are what your issues are, this is what you need, but it's trying to find the balance between technical expertise, which planners do have, because I mean, obviously we go to school to study this stuff, da 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 da, but expertise that comes by virtue of a lived experience, right? Because
right.
people know what's going on. They may not necessarily be able to name it with the terms that we are accustomed to, but they they see what's going on. And
Hmm.
so the model that I talked about kind of like flipping it, I think is also challenging that power dynamic where you find the balance between technical expertise, but also lived expertise. And also knowing when it can't be balanced and it has to be one more than the other. Again, to address past harms, to address inequities, and so on and so forth. Like I think
Right.
there's absolutely space for planners to take a back seat, if not, if not just not be in the room at all, in order for us to really, do the work in the way that needs to be done and chart a path forward that's a lot more equitable and inclusive and whatnot. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that. when planning the the conference sessions, I would always bring in planners when I could. And in the setup for one of them, one of the planners, they talked about this issue of having very unequal buckets of knowledge. And it wasn't like one was a bigger bucket of knowledge. They're just very different. And there's a lot of, understanding code and process that is incredibly relevant that planners have, but equally true about the community.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
it is equally, yeah. And again, I think, similar to what I talked about in terms of like teachers and social workers, you'll see how all that stuff like just comes together.
yep.
There, if you were to in a day, like let's say you just like in one day, you can probably experience all the different ways in which things conflict and create really uncomfortable, if not oppressive kind of experiences within the built environment.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that is important to kind of like balance out the more technical, like, well, this is what the code says, what the law says, and so on and so forth. Because the
Yeah,
code and the law doesn't say how it all comes together and impacts somebody's day-to-day experience.
exactly. I
You
mean,
know,
when you were talking about, women versus men or female identified and male, anyway, through different spaces immediately, and I will pop this somewhere in the links. A museum professional who's also a historian of, I think, specifically African American history, named Gretchen Soren, did a piece about um, driving and
mhm.
being Black, and talking about just this notion of having to go through white spaces when you're Black. So, I mean, it's that same issue. It's like, if that's not your lived experience, you don't recognize that,
You don't. You
moving in
don't.
certain spaces can be extremely
Right.
scary and sometimes dangerous.
It is.
Um,
And and I think that is the blind spot that planners have a lot. Because again, like, and you'll see, this, and I say this as somebody who's currently working in transportation planning, but obviously a lot of cities these days are really trying to lean into the whole bike thing, right? Encourage people to get out of their cars, be more active, so on and so forth. And I'm all for it. I mean, from so many different, points of view, I think it makes for better, you know, uh, uh, um, experiences in cities when you have less cars on the road and you just have people occupying the street with, that kind of stuff. But again, you have to understand that space is not agnostic. Built environment is not agnostic. It's never been the case. Again, community development is a function of systemic racism, and just racism, just period. Um, and so, how people move through space, how people show up in space, is not uniform. How people
right,
move through space is not uniform, and so to just it's never really as simple as putting that green paint down and trying to reduce, vehicle miles traveled,
right.
because
And I
how
mean,
you move,
even
yeah,
how you move through it, and also we haven't changed the mindset when people drive
no,
at all.
right. No, we haven't. We haven't. And so there's so much work that needs to be done that doesn't always get done to do what I personally have coined the term of establishing the planning continuum, right? To
Mhm.
be able to weave a story through time that justifies or just provides context as to why X needs to happen. So it's not just, hey, we need bike lanes because they're cool and they're slick and yada, and the bike lobbyists really really want it and all this kind of stuff. But it's just like there's actually a very a real reason as to why we should you know return to equilibrium, the different ways in which people can and should and do move through their communities. But for you to be able to do that and do that genuinely and authentically, you have to tell a much, much, much comprehensive history. And that makes people uncomfortable because what A, because it takes a lot of time, but B, ultimately you have to name racism for what it is.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there you go.
That's it.
Um, yeah. So I'm just looking at the time and thinking I need to be respectful of your time. So I'm just going to jump to a last question that I totally forgot to run by you because I thought of it this morning, which is, um, are there specific organizations or people or publications that you love to follow that you could recommend? I mean, obviously, super technical isn't going to work for museum folks, but more generally,
Yeah. Um, so again, it varies, right?
right?
There are some publications that are topic specific. So for example, in the mobility world, I know that Streets blog is a very popular and important resource. Um, and there are I think there's like a Streets blog USA, but then like communities or states might have like street blogs that are like specific
Mm.
to like their stuff. So in terms of transportation, I think Streets blog could be a good place for people to start. Next City is a great publication.
Yay, next city.
I think they cover a lot of different stuff. And again, it's a publication that is really focused on essentially planning. I don't think they necessarily say planning, but it's
They
about
don't say
cities.
that. But
Yeah,
it's entirely solutions focused. That's the
yeah,
Vanguard that I'm going to in
that's
Richmond,
right.
or
You're a
will have gone
Vanguard.
to.
Yeah,
It's a nonprofit journalism that focuses. It's very solutions focused, and it
correct.
is very omnivorous. And so it's
Hmm.
just anything that is a solution in one city or
Yep,
multiple cities that could be applied elsewhere.
yep,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, Next City's a great. Yeah, I'm a fan of the Vanguard program. I know I remember looking into it some years ago. I think it was honestly pre-COVID. Um, I think Planetizen is another
Oh yeah.
nice place to start. It, yeah, I think they do a good job of talking about different things. I think Curbed is another one that comes to mind. I'm wondering if yeah,
Hmm.
Curbed is another publication that comes to mind. I'm trying to just pull it up real quick, and I think Curbed is one of those things where there are you can look at different, yeah, I have it pulled up here. So there's like a Curved Atlanta, Curved Boston, Curved Chicago,
Hmm.
Curved New York. So, I think even if you don't live in any of these cities and there are a few more, I think it's again another good way of tapping into information that's out there. So those are just a few that come
Those are
to
few.
mind.
Yeah. I mean, and you already mentioned the Smart Growth Alliance.
Yeah, Smart Growth
Um,
Alliance is a good place to keep in touch with stuff. And gosh, it's one of those things where it's like as soon as you ask a question, you just start blanking
you're
on what the
blanking, but I
resources
know
are.
because this is why I should have told you the question. Because the other one I think is Groundwork.
Yeah.
There's Groundwork USA, but then they have them in different cities. I know there's one in Lawrence, Massachusetts. There's one in Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, I think there's one in
Um,
Somerville too.
there might be. Yeah, and
Hmm.
that's just super grassroots on just like implementing solutions
Yeah.
of all
Um,
types.
yeah, another good one, and this is for folks who either are interested in policy. Policy Link, I think, is
Hmm,
another good place. They're based in the West Coast, if I'm not mistaken, like Frisco
cool.
or Oakland. I think Oakland.
Hmm.
Um, but that's another a good resource to tap into. I'm trying to think of this one more.
That's plenty.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, no, thank you
Oh,
very much.
yeah.
Unless you have any other closing words,
Um,
but I think
no, I just
this
again,
was great.
I always appreciate the opportunity for us to chat about this stuff, and
We always chat, identify all the problems in the world as we see them, and then just
right,
solve them by talking.
that's it. Yeah, it's done. Our work is done here. But yeah, no, I
Exactly.
mean, hopefully this is helpful for your viewers and listeners, and I'm sure
Absolutely.
we'll find ways to keep the conversation going in the future. So just
Absolutely.
thanks again
Thank
for
you.
asking.
Cool. Thank you.